the seeds of trust are actually sown in radical candor. So you want to try to say the thing, but you want to say it in a way that shows that you care. And then you want to notice how the other person responds. And if they seem sad or mad, that's your cue to move up on care personally. And if they brush you off the way I did my boss, that's your cue to move out a little further. Then you may be comfortable going on challenge directly. So it's radical candor gets measured not at the speaker's mouth, but at the listener's ear, for sure.
Hi, I'm Rob Sadow, and you're listening to the Flex Perspectives podcast, where we interview the world's best thinkers, researchers, and operators on how to make flexible work work. Flex Perspectives is brought to you by Flex Index, the leading global data set for company-specific approaches to flexible work. Flex Index represents more than 9,000 companies, 75,000 office locations, and 100 million people. Today, my guest is Kim Scott. Kim is a celebrated author of Radical Candor that has sold more than 1 million copies in the recently released Radical Respect. In this episode, Kim talks about how hybrid and distributed work influence how we engage with others in a work setting. Kim shares her personal journey to writing Radical Candor and provides actionable takeaways for how to be a better executive and team member in a hybrid work setting. If you enjoy this podcast, please help us out by subscribing and giving us a rating. It helps us understand what episodes our listeners find most valuable and helps new listeners find the podcast.
This episode of Flex Perspectives is brought to you by Office Benchmarks. In today's hybrid world, workplace executives face critical lease and space allocation decisions. Make the wrong move and it could cost millions, impact productivity, and hurt retention. You need reliable data, not news headlines. That's why companies like TD Bank, Southwest, and Chime rely on Office Benchmarks. Office Benchmarks is the only solution that combines flexible work policy and office usage metrics to help workplace leaders compare their footprint, space design, and usage to peers with similar policies. Get started today at flex.scoopforwork.com.
Kim, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you. I'm excited for our conversation.
So Kim, you are obviously quite well known for the work that you've done around the iconic Radical Candor, both the book and all of the things that have come from the book. But before that, one of the things I find most fascinating is your set of work experiences is quite eclectic. And yes. I think you've done a ton of different stuff. And so take me through some of your early journey and how those things led to some of the thinking that came into the book.
Yeah, well, it all started when I read a lot of Russian novels, long Russian novels. I studied Slavic literature and then moved to Moscow, where I actually had my first management experience. I was supposed to hire some diamond cutters for this diamond cutting factory that I was starting for a New York-based firm. And I knew nothing about business. I was 22 and had studied, as I said, Russian literature. And so I thought it was going to be easy. I had dollars. The ruble had cratered. But then when I went and talked to these guys, they didn't just take the job, to my surprise. They wanted more. They wanted to have a picnic. All right, well, I could have a picnic too. That's also qualified to do that. And by the time we finished a bottle of vodka, it became very clear to me that what they wanted was to have a boss who gave a damn, who would get them out of Russia if things went sideways. So as you can imagine, I've been thinking a lot about those guys. So that was early in my career.
And then we're from there. Yeah, diamond cutting was the start,
yes,
which, by the way, is quite unusual. I feel like 22-year-old starts the career. But
yes. Well, things were very strange at that time in the former Soviet Union. And so I lived there for about 4 years and then had enough, wanted to come back home, went to business school. I did a few failed startups. And then I took a job at Google that worked out a lot better. In between those failed startups, I did some cool stuff. Also, a friend of mine is a pediatrician, so I went to manage a pediatric clinic in Kosovo for a summer, just after the bombing, actually, in
Wow.
1999. And after those experiences, then I went to Google, and then I went to Apple. After I'd been at Google for about 6 years, I realized that what I really cared about was building a great team, was the management stuff that I had learned about originally with those diamond cutters. And I didn't care that much about cost per click, although cost per click was going all right.
It seems like that was working out just fine at the time.
Yeah,
also.
yeah. But it wasn't interesting, especially. And so Steve Jobs had decided that he was going to throw away all of Apple's management training and start from a blank piece of paper. And that was how I wound up at Apple, so-called Apple University, to design and teach a class called Managing at Apple.
And so for a lot of folks who are familiar, and maybe I'm not going to assume that everyone knows what Radical Candor is. I bet a lot of people who are listening do. But give a sense of maybe the scale in some way in terms of like, I don't know if you can say how many books have been sold or readership widely, but I want people to understand where it is today. And then I kind of want to wind back and talk a little bit about how you came up with the idea and how you got there.
Yeah. So, it was very exciting to me that Radical Candor got published at all, in fact, because I had written 3 novels that never got published. And so I wasn't especially hopeful about it. And then it launched and it hit on Amazon number 11, just behind The Very Hungry Caterpillar.
And that which is a favorite in my household,
yes,
by the way,
exactly.
Right now. Yes.
It's a great book, The Very Hungry Caterpillar. I was honored to be in the same league.
That's how know you've arrived at that point.
Exactly. So since the book launched, it's sold well over 1 million copies, been translated into 22 different languages, maybe actually 24 now. Just came out in a couple more languages. And I've been lucky enough to be able to be invited to do talks all over the world about Radical Candor. So it definitely, sort of took off. And why? I don't know, but I'm glad it did. It finally, because, in many ways, my whole business career was a giant plan to subsidize my novel writing habit. And so Radical Candor finally brought my career and my writing together.
Is there a particular moment that you can trace back to the initial instinct about writing Radical Candor, or did it come from one experience that kind of expanded out to become a book? How did the earliest innings of that take place?
I think it probably all started. The seed of the book was planted in my head when I was leading this startup company called Juice Software. And I came into work one day and 10 of the 60 people that worked at the company had emailed me the same article about how most employees would rather have a boss who's a total asshole but really competent than one who is incompetent but really nice. And I thought, are they sending me this because they think I'm a jerk or because they think I'm incompetent? And surely those are not my 2 choices. And in many ways, Radical Candor, which is about caring personally and challenging directly at the same time, was used a 2x2 framework to break free of that false dichotomy that I think a lot of us have. We think, either you're going to be a super successful jerk or you're going to be nice but not as successful. And we don't have to make that choice.
And so that was the original instinct around. But you didn't start writing until years later.
Later, yeah. Probably the origin story of Radical Candor came shortly after I joined Google, and I had to give a presentation to the founders and the CEO about how the AdSense business was doing. And I walked into the room, and there's one of the founders in a bright blue spandex unitard, super tight. Not what I was. Stepping away on an elliptical trainer wearing toe shoes, not what I was wanting or expecting to see in the room. And the CEO was doing his email so I was nervous, like probably anybody in that situation. And I wondered, how was I going to get their attention? Luckily, the AdSense business was on fire and that got their attention. The CEO said, do you need more engineers, more marketing dollars? And so I'm feeling like the meeting's going all right at this point. In fact, I now believe that I am a genius. And I walked out of the room. I walked past my boss and I'm expecting a high five, a pat on the back. And instead she says to me, "You said a lot in there. Were you aware of it?" And I thought, oh gosh, but I was like, is it really such a big deal? And I kind of made this brush off gesture with my hand. And then she said, I said, "It's no big deal. It's a verbal tick." And then she said, "I know this great speech coach. I bet Google would pay for it. Would you like an introduction?" And once again, I made this brush off gesture. I said, "I'm busy. I don't have time for a speech coach. Didn't you hear about all those new customers?" And then she stops. She looks me right in the eye and she said, "I can tell when you do that thing with your hand that I'm going to have to be a lot more direct with you. When you say, every third word, it makes you sound stupid.
Wow.
Yes, wow is right. Now she's got my full attention. And some people might say it was mean of her to say that I sounded stupid. But in fact, it was the kindest thing she could have done for me at that moment in my career. Because if she hadn't used just those words with me, and by the way, she never would have used those words with other people on her team who were a better listener than I was. It's a very important point, right? But she knew me well enough to know that if she didn't use just those words with me, that I never would have gone to visit the speech coach, and I wouldn't have learned that she was not exaggerating. I literally said every third word. And this was news to me because I had raised money for 3 different startups. Giving presentations, I thought I was pretty good at it. Has that ever happened to you? Where like all of a sudden I realized that it was like I'd been marching through my whole career with a giant hunk of spinach between my teeth, and nobody had told me that it was there.
It reminds me of so I started my career at Bain doing consulting.
Oh, yeah. So you did a lot of those presentations.
I did a lot of those presentations, but I also remember a framework, of course, is 2x2 because it was consulting, right? But there was a framework that was used sometimes in the New York office where I started around confidence and competence, which is different but related. And the idea was there are times, and especially for new grads who would start, where actually confidence would far outstrip competence. Yes. And you actually had to like break that down a little bit to create a space where they're willing to learn and figure out how to grow them in tandem. So it reminds me of that in a way, in terms of like, how do you figure out how to marry those so that one doesn't kind of like move at a different pace than the other?
Yes, exactly. And so the 2x2, and by the way, I spent a summer at McKinsey, which is where I learned that a good 2x2 can solve all of life's hardest problems. Which is true. It's really, I think it's very interesting. We, as human beings, we optimize on one thing at a time, and we often get ourselves in trouble. So, AI can optimize on a million things at once, but at least going from 1 to 2 is a step function change for mere mortals. And the 2 things that I realized were true for my boss was that she cared personally and she challenged directly at the same time. And that was sort of where I started thinking about this. Radical Candor is a 2x2, where the vertical axis is care personally and the horizontal axis is challenge directly, and the upper right-hand quadrant is Radical Candor.
So one of the things I've been wanting to ask you about this, and I was excited to ask you, was how situational is it? Meaning, do you think your manager had a really good sense of who you are and that you could handle that comment, and that maybe it would break somebody else, but for you, actually, it was going to inspire the right behavior? And so how do you get to the foundation to actually be able to figure out how to apply that correctly as a manager?
Yeah, it was very situational. And it's obviously much easier to do if you know the person well enough. And my boss knew me well enough to know that it wouldn't break me. In fact, I would brush her off until she went that far out on the challenge directly dimension. But it doesn't, the fact that it's situational doesn't mean you can't use this with a perfect stranger. Or with someone you're just getting to know. If you hang out in what I call ruinous empathy, which is what happens when you care but you don't challenge, then, I'm in Silicon Valley, so we talk a lot about technical debt, but I think a lot about feedback debt. And if you spend too much time hanging out in ruinous empathy, you get feedback debt, and that can create a problem that's very hard to break through. So you want to make sure that you remember that the seeds of trust are actually sown in Radical Candor. So you want to try to say the thing, but you want to say it in a way that shows that you care. And then you want to notice how the other person responds. And if they seem sad or mad, that's your cue to move up on care personally. And if they brush you off the way I did my boss, that's your cue to move out a little further. Then you may be comfortable going on challenge directly. So it's Radical Candor gets measured not at the speaker's mouth, but at the listener's ear, for sure.
Which makes perfect sense. So with over 1,000, I think you said 1 million copies, right, that have been sold, I imagine you've probably gotten feedback all across the spectrum on Radical. So are there any kind of Radical Candor moments, so to speak, that encapsulate kind of like both the notion in the book, but also are kind of like feedback in that style that you received?
100%. If you write a book about feedback, you're going to get a lot of it. And indeed, I did. And sometimes it was really painful but useful. So one time I was on a flight to London, and when I landed, my phone had just blown up because the HBO show Silicon Valley had done a whole episode sort of mocking Radical Candor. It was really an episode on obnoxious aggression, which is what's in that bottom right hand quadrant. That's what happens when you challenge but you don't show you care. Or manipulative insincerity, which is in the bottom left-hand quadrant, where you neither care nor challenge. But of course, they called both of those things radical candor. So it was at first a little painful. Then I
The
realized,
highest form of flattery in a way, though,
yes,
right? To have
yeah,
them do
and
that.
it sold a lot of books. Like I wish they would mock me again. It was it was very helpful. But it did make me realize something important, which is that because I had also noticed, like sometimes I'll be working with a team and somebody will charge into a room and they'll say, in the spirit of radical candor, and then they'll act like a garden variety jerk. And that is not the spirit of radical candor. That's the spirit of obnoxious aggression. So if that is happening, I recommend calling it compassionate candor. And in fact, in the second edition of the book, I offer a whole new 2x2 where the upper right hand quadrant is compassionate candor. But I still call the book Radical Candor because that sells better. It sounds cooler. But compassionate candor is probably closer to what I really mean.
Yeah,
So,
radical candor still just has a certain, I think, weight to it. That's hard to beat.
Yeah, it sounds more fun. I don't know why compassion doesn't sound fun. Actually, I could write a whole other book on that because compassion is fun. It's more fun than harshness. But anyway, so that was kind of what I would say is the second most helpful feedback I got. But the most helpful feedback I got is what actually prompted me to write Radical Respect. So this happened shortly after the book came out. I was at a tech company in San Francisco doing the talk, and the CEO of this company had been a colleague of mine for the better part of a decade. And she's a person I like and respect enormously. So I was very excited to go and talk to her and her team. And when I finished giving the talk, she pulled me aside and she said, Kim, I'm excited to roll out Radical Candor. I think it's going to help me build the kind of culture I want, but I got to tell you, it's much harder for me than it is for you. And she went on to explain to me that as soon as she would offer people even the most gentle, compassionate candor, they would call her an angry Black woman. And I knew this was true, and it was so painful for me because I also knew how unfair it was. But she's one of the most even-keeled people I'd ever met. And as soon as she said this to me, I had 4 realizations at the same time. The first was that as an upstander, I had failed to be an upstander. I had been a silent bystander, in fact, which is not how I imagine myself. That's not who I want to be. I realized, I had failed even to notice the extent to which she had to show up unfailingly cheerful and pleasant in every meeting we had ever been in together, even though she had what to be ticked off about. So that was realization number 1. Realization number 2, I realized that not only had I been in denial about the things that were happening to her in the workplace, I'd also been in denial about the things that had happened to me in the workplace. Kind of hard for the author of a book called Radical Candor to admit, but I had gone through my career pretending that a whole bunch of things were not happening that were in fact happening. And I think I did that because I never wanted to think of myself or of her, for that matter, as victims. But even less than wanting to think of myself as a victim, that I want to think of myself as the culprit, which brings me to my third realization, which is that I was most deeply in denial about the times when my disrespectful attitudes or behaviors had made it harder for the people around me to do their best work than it needed to be. And then the fourth thing, of course, is that I realized as a leader, I imagined I was creating these BS-free zones where everybody could do the best work of their lives. But by pretending that these disrespectful attitudes and behaviors were not making themselves manifest, I was unable to prevent them. So there you go. That's a big drink of water. 4 realizations.
Well, it sounds like the common theme is self-awareness, right? Like if there's a intentionality in some ways around radical candor and the way you communicate to drive certain outcomes or connections, this seems much more around being reflective of who you are and how you act in a much more kind of like internally facing type of way.
Yeah. Well, and also Radical Candor is a lot about soliciting feedback and being willing to become aware of what you're doing wrong. And it's one thing to get feedback about saying every third word. It's another thing to get feedback that you've been biased, or that you bullied someone, or that an attitude that, or a belief that you have, actually incorporates some kind of unfair and inaccurate stereotype. And so, Radical Respect was in many ways a much harder book to write, but also a more important book and a more fun book. I mean, denial is a heavy burden that we carry around, and not even aware that we're carrying it around. So it was very cathartic to write the book. And the teams that I've worked with to roll out the ideas in the book have found it cathartic to implement it as well.
Do you think of Radical Respect and some of the thought processes therein as complementary in some ways to Radical Candor, or is it just a different axis to be thinking about? Like, how do you think about the relationship there?
Yeah, I think Radical Respect is kind of the prequel to Radical Candor. Because if you don't respect someone, you're not going to bother challenging them. And you're also not going to, you're not going to care personally. It's hard to care about someone that you don't have respect for. And respect, when I talk about Radical Respect, I'm talking about not something you have to earn, like there's respect for your skills or whatever, you have to earn that. But there's two definitions. Words are so complicated because there's two very different definitions. So the definition I'm talking about when I'm talking about respect is the regard that we owe each other for each other's feelings, each other's backgrounds, for each other's individuality. And that is really important to remember, that that's sort of a human birthright. It's not something that someone has to earn.
So one of the things I was really excited to talk to you about, and especially because, as you know, we spent a lot of time thinking about flexible work and the evolution of work, is some of these topics that you've written about prolifically and spoken about. It's one thing to have those conversations in person, right? Like I'm imagining the conversation around the ums and having that face-to-face and seeing the gesture in that particular way. Totally different thing in some ways in a hybrid environment or a remote environment where you're with the person, maybe less in person, or you have to give feedback differently.
Yes.
And so how has, if at all, this shift toward hybrid or more distributed work impacted the way you think about these topics around feedback and the way you show up? I'm curious what your point of view is.
Yeah. So Radical Candor, the company, is a fully remote company. We're in different cities all over the world, actually. And so here's the good news, because it does seem easier to offer Radical Candor and also to disrupt disrespect. It seems easier in person, but it may not be. So there's really interesting evidence coming out of University of Chicago that demonstrates that there may be more noise than signal in facial expressions and body language. And it turns out a telephone call may be the best way to have these conversations. Definitely do not text someone feedback. Do not send them an email. And Slack is just a Radical Candor train wreck waiting to happen. But even in a remote situation, you can pick up the phone and call someone. It can be difficult time zone wise. Sometimes there's not as much overlap in waking hours, but hopefully there's enough overlap in waking hours that you can pick up the phone and call someone. So in fact, even if you are in person, I recommend taking a walk instead of looking them in the eye. Like, we're mammals, and looking someone in the eye, especially around a topic that can be difficult to hear about, can feel aggressive. So that's one bit of good news about the remote work environment, is that we may be able to offer better feedback remotely over the phone.
You know, it's interesting because I think so many companies, just as a virtue or a byproduct maybe of the experience of going through the pandemic, now have video on for everything. Right. Yeah. Like basically all of your meetings are video on all day long. And sometimes it can feel like the person who doesn't have video on, especially in larger meetings, is disengaged or not present. Like I think there's been a couple of studies that come out that say that people expect that the people who are off video are not paying attention in the same capacity. And so it strikes me that maybe if that's right, there needs to be a bit of a re-norming, if you will, around conversations where you're not always in front of video all the time, so you can have some of those discussions.
It's much more important to pay attention to people's contributions in a meeting. In fact, one of the things I talk about in Radical Respect is a subtle form of bullying, which I call bloviating bullshit. And that's the person.
You have such a talent for the terminology, by the way. These like quips are fantastic.
I love words. So these are the people who sort of take up more than their fair share of airtime. And the great thing about remote work is it's easy to get a report. Otter AI at the top of every of your report that you get at the end, it'll tell you how many people were in the meeting and what percentage of the time each person spoke. And there's an awful lot of evidence that demonstrates that when teams participate roughly equally, they get better outcomes than when some sort of quote unquote superstar on the team dominates. So it's another way that we need to optimize for collaboration. And it's much easier to do that remotely. I mean, I guess you could have Otter AI record an in-person meeting, but it would feel a little, it's not quite a norm. So again, I think there are real opportunities with remote work to create better work environments.
One of the things you and I have talked about that I continue to find interesting is this idea of, is everyone in the small square helpful or not helpful, right? Like I've heard some discussion around, well, you kind of take stature out, or kind of position at the table out, if you will. And as a result, everybody's got the same real estate. And is that better for participation, or does it make it harder to engage when you're just looking at the square? I'm curious if you have a point of view on this.
So Ellen Powell, who leads Project Include, has done interesting research that shows that people who are underrepresented experience more bias, prejudice, and bullying when they're just a little square than in person. Because it's somehow, when someone is just a little square on a screen, it may be they may become an easier receptacle for your bias, for one's biases, etc. Also, I think in it's people kind of, when you're in person, the eye roll is a little more pronounced. And so I think we actually tamp down bullying a little bit better in person than we do remotely if we're not conscious of it. So that's one bit of evidence that the little squares, may solve some problems, but they may create other problems. However, there's also evidence from Best Places to Work that people who are underrepresented actually prefer remote work to in-person work because they feel safer. And so at first, this feels very paradoxical. Why do people feel safer when they're experiencing statistically more bias, prejudice, and bullying? And I think the answer is because if you can slam down your computer at the end of a meeting and be in your own space and scream, it's gaslighting maybe is less pronounced. You feel more secure in your own space. But this sort of brings us to a point that it's really important to make sure that we are disrupting bias when we notice it, that we're taking proactive stance. And I think it's incumbent upon leaders to create a norm of disrupting bias, especially in a remote work environment.
Are the actions you take different, you think, in a fully remote environment versus hybrid versus fully in office when it comes to disrupting bias?
Not necessarily. I mean, there's 3 steps that I recommend, whether you're in person or remote. The first is to come up with a shared vocabulary. What are you going to say or do? Very often we say and do nothing because we don't know what to say. And so getting people comfortable saying, I don't think you meant that the way it sounded, or I like to wave a purple flag, which works remotely as well as if I'm on video, as well as in person. So you want a shared vocabulary. The second thing you need to do as leaders to teach people how to respond when they're the one who said or done the biased thing, because we often feel ashamed in those moments. And I don't know about you, but when I'm in shame brain, I don't respond at my best. I'm sort of like my executive function has shut down and my fight or flight response is fully engaged. And so teaching people to move through those moments, there's no way to point out bias to me that's not going to trigger a little shame response. So it's up to me to manage my own shame response, not up to you to manage it for me. And so just teaching people to say, thank you for pointing it out. Either I get it, I'm working on it, but tell me if I make the same mistake again, which we probably will, actually. Very often these biased patterns of speech are deeply ingrained and take a while to change those habits. Or I don't get it. And I don't get it is even harder to say because, now I'm doubly ashamed. I've hurt someone and I'm ignorant. I don't know what I did wrong. But we're all going to be in that situation. And so sort of normalizing that, letting people know it's not like a sign you're an inferior human being. If you have to say, thanks for pointing it out, but I don't get it. Talk to me after the meeting. And then the third thing you need to do is to build stamina for actually doing this. And that is true in person or online. I think there's an opportunity. I don't know. What do you think about that? And then I have another idea.
That's a good question. I think building stamina is different. I have to imagine whether you're full-time in office or fully remote, right? Because it probably is a different set of behaviors if I'm on a Zoom call versus if I'm in a conference room with you, or if we're going to sit next to each other for another 4 hours, or to your point, I slam the laptop down. So I'm curious your take on it, but I imagine it's pretty context dependent in terms of how do you approach some of that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, there are different things that are hard and easy about remote versus in person. But the nice thing about remote is that you can say, if I don't get it, I can say, I don't get it. Can you drop it into chat? Right? It can be less disruptive to the meeting. Whereas if you're in person, it's a little awkward to say, tell me after the meeting. But I think it's important actually not to talk about it in the meeting, because the promise of bias disruption is that it's going to disrupt bias without disrupting the whole meeting. So it can't. The other thing that could make it way easier is if AI in Zoom could, or whatever whatever platform you're using, could give you a private heads up,
gentle nudges.
Yeah, like, hey, you just called that woman abrasive, and that's often a biased term. Or you just called, that guy, an asshole, and that's often a biased term. And that can really, it's also, it has additional issues, but I think that there's an opportunity for AI, because we're less defensive when we get it from. There's no way another person can tell me that I've said or done something that's biased. That's not going to trigger that shame brain. But if this little AI bot tells me, then maybe I'm more open to it. So I was trying to persuade the CEO of Otter AI to do this. So maybe
any luck in progress?
He was interested in the idea, so we're exploring it.
That's cool. One thing I was curious about too, maybe a different dimension around hybrid from some of the things we were talking about, is, in my opinion, hybrid creates this new interesting vector, if you will, where when everybody was in the office and that was just kind of understood, and to be clear, that had its own issues in terms of workforce participation, inclusion, et cetera. But when everybody was in the office, everybody's in the office, at least for the most part, right? In this world where we're now hybrid and increasingly distributed, now you have individual needs versus team needs that kind of come to the forefront in a much more significant way in terms of what do I want, in terms of how I show up and what that looks like versus what the team needs. And how do you handle some of the kind of like respect as a leader for what other people want versus finding that balance and trying to harmonize that around the team, and how that might even impact things like opportunity and proximity bias. I feel like that's a complicated topic too, as it comes to kind of like respect and interpersonal interaction in these more hybrid environments.
Yes. I think in a hybrid environment, it's much more important to be aware of these different kinds of biases. In particular, there's leaders there's exceptions, but by and large, they tend to be a little bit more extroverted. And so they tend to want more than the majority of people, maybe as a group. They tend to skew towards let's return to office, and that is really going to hurt your ability to retain the best team. I think if you force everyone to work the same way, and so I think it's really important to be aware of the ways in which you're favoring the people who are sitting physically with you versus people on the phone. And this is true. This was true. I mean, when I was at Google, I was managing teams in 20 different countries. And there were people in Europe and people in Asia who said, do I have to move to California to get a promotion? I don't want to move to California. You don't want me to move to California, but I do want a promotion. And so it was really important to make sure that I was giving leadership opportunities to people who were not physically with me. So I think that is a really important way that sort of unconscious bias can turn into discrimination if you don't watch out, which is optimizing for people who are physically near you. Another thing that I found about distributed work is that we talked earlier about time zones, and I often was wound up talking to people more who were in adjacent time zones. And so one thing I did to manage against that was to work 1 week per quarter. Even if I didn't travel to Europe, I would work European hours. And 1 week per quarter, I would work Asian hours so that there was more overlap. And it was a little exhausting, but it was less exhausting than TSA and jet lag.
Totally. I mean, I have 2 young kids. I'm effectively doing that sometimes anyway by accident, depending on how their sleep schedules are. So it makes sense to me. I mean, I think the other piece of it that, that strikes me as very interesting around hybrid is coming all the way back to not just radical respect, but radical candor. For better or for worse, I think when people were in full-time in office, some of performance management was, do I see this person in the office? Even though it probably shouldn't have been, but it's like, okay, is this person there like X number of hours a day? They must be working hard, right? Even though all of us know that's not the case. Yeah. But in a hybrid environment or remote environment, that kind of all comes away, right? It has to be much more oriented toward, do we accomplish the goals that we set out, or results, right? And so it feels like radical candor in some ways is even more important in those types of environment, because you have to drive to the outcome. And that's kind of like, there's no hiding around that. And being able to push with the right level of empathy or compassion feels even more important. Maybe it should have been just as important before, but now it's even more important in this type of environment.
Yeah, and getting to know people, being conscious of taking a little extra time at the beginning of a staff meeting, for example, to let people tell stories from the weekend is really important, because that is kind of how we get to know each other. And the more we get to know each other, the more we like each other. But it's also more efficient, because if you let people go around and say what's a funny story from the weekend, or what did you have to leave outside of this Zoom in order to be fully present, then you'll find out what's going on for people. And if you don't find out, invariably I'll come into a Zoom meeting and I'll be scowling, and everybody thinks I'm mad at them. But the reason I'm scowling is because my dog just pooped on the rug. And if you give me a chance to say that, then you can interpret my scowl more correctly. And so I think it's really useful to focus on what are we going to do to get to know each other a little bit? What are we going to do to recreate those water cooler moments where we heard about the new puppy, naturally, and sort of connect before content. I think that's really important. And if we have left sort of office FaceTime behind with remote work, like, hallelujah.
I think there are a lot of people who would agree with that sentiment.
Yes, let's focus on the results. And by the way, having more empathy for someone who's in the office a long time, but not necessarily getting more results, is an example of empathy gone awry, of ruinous empathy, as I call it in Radical Candor. Because, it's good that this person is working really hard, but that is not what you should be focusing on. You should be focusing on their results.
Yeah. And I think we typically, at least in the United States, it feels like we have a history of lionizing effort sometimes over outcome in particular types of work. And,
Yes.
and this would be maybe a good impetus to reset the way that we view that collectively.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's also important, by the way, to be aware that different people work differently. Like some people really do like to work 80 hours a week. And I remember when I was at Apple, there was this team that I was working with, and they worked all the time. And I was talking to a colleague of mine, and I said, "Why do they do this?" Because I would have been miserable working those kinds of hours, 80, 90 hours a week. And my colleague looked at me and said, "Well, they like it." And I was like, "Oh." And it was kind of a revelation. There was another colleague of mine when I was at Google, this guy who worked for me, and he worked sort of like that, 80 hours a week, but only for 10 months a year. He needed to take a 2-month bender every year and go take photographs and do God knows what else. And that was the way he worked most productively. And it was my job as his boss to make that possible. Going back to how can you create a work environment where the individual gets what they need, but also the collective gets what they need. And the strength of the team is the individual. The strength of the individual is the team. So,
but to your point, it's not about instilling my sense of what is good, or kind of like the work dynamics that I want. It's actually about finding them where they are, right?
Yeah.
And you might shift it a little bit, but there's not one unequivocal sense of like what the right answer is in terms of hours worked or approach or anything like that.
Yeah. And that's another bias. We tend to read ourselves into other people's stories. Some people work really well, 80 hours a week. And I might say, "Oh, you're going to burn out." But that's their choice. I'm not, but I'm not going to let them impose that choice on me because I do not work well in that situation.
Totally. So maybe as we wrap up, are there maybe if you could give one piece of advice and say, okay, if you were an individual operating in a hybrid or a distributed environment, you're a team operating that way, or you're an executive in that. If you wanted to apply some of the principled thinking that you laid out in Radical Respect to that environment, what is one thing that each of those stakeholders should do differently tomorrow, if they could, to kind of embrace that a little bit better?
So I think if you're an individual, whether you're an upstander or the person who's harmed by disrespectful attitudes or behaviors, it's useful to break down those attitudes and behaviors into their component parts, because so often we treat this problem, just the problem of disrespect, as this monolithic problem, and then it seems impossible to solve. So let's break it down. Bias, prejudice, and bullying. Think of bias as not meaning it. It's unconscious. And you can respond to it with an I statement. I don't think you meant that the way it sounded. Whereas prejudice is a very consciously held belief, usually incorporating some kind of unfair and inaccurate stereotype. So you want to respond to prejudice with an it statement. And an it statement can appeal to the law. It can appeal to an HR policy, or it can appeal to common sense. So it is illegal to, it is an HR violation to, or it is ridiculous to, and that can help sort of demarcate the boundary between one person's freedom to believe whatever they want, but they can't impose that belief on you. So if an I statement holds up a mirror, that's not going to work in the case of prejudice. That's why you need an id statement. Sometimes it's bullying, and there's not a belief, conscious or unconscious. It's just somebody is being mean. So if bias is not meaning it, prejudice is meaning it, bullying is being mean. And with bullying, you want a you statement. You can't talk to me like that, or what's going on for you here, or even a you non sequitur, like where'd you get that shirt? The point is, with bullying, you kind of want to push that person away. You don't want to take what they're dishing out at you, and you want to be in an active stance. So that's my advice for upstanders and individuals who are harmed by sort of disrespectful attitudes and behaviors. I think if you are a leader on a team, the most important thing you can do is create consequences for bullying. You want to create career consequences for bullying. Well, first, conversational consequences for bullying. You want to shut it down when you notice it. You want to create compensation consequences. You don't want to give people who bully others high ratings or big bonuses. And thirdly, you want to create career consequences. There comes a moment on too many teams where the jerks begin to win. And that's the moment where the culture begins to lose. So do not promote people who bully others, even if they're getting good results, because they're doing more harm than good. Instead, you've got to give them some feedback that their behavior is not acceptable. And then if they cannot change their behavior, you've got to fire them, even if it feels like it's going to leave a gaping hole on your team, because it's better to have a hole than an asshole.
So great. And then so you talked about leaders of teams. Anything about executives in particular? So you think about like C-level folks and who are operating in this type of environment?
So for C-level folks, it's really important to remember that if you don't design your management systems to be fair, you're going to get systemic injustice in the natural, even if that's not your intention. And I write a lot about this in Radical Respect. Times when I formed these teams, when I started companies, and people told me they felt like I had created a hostile work environment. Obviously, that was not my intention, but I hadn't put enough intention behind the management systems in order to prevent this from happening. So you want to do a couple of things. You want to measure what matters at every stage of the employee life cycle. You want to look for bias, proactively measure bias. And who do you invite into interview? Who do you extend offers to? Your pay data, you need to cut it by the different demographics that you're trying to improve diversity on. You want to make sure you pay attention to promotions or the right percentages of people, the expected percentages of people getting promoted. So that's one really important thing that you can do for your management systems is measure what matters, quantify bias at every stage of the employee life cycle. The other thing you can do is to create checks and balances, because a little bit of power corrupts a lot. And when people get a little power, when managers get a little power, they're much more likely to bully others, to harass others, than they are if they don't have power. And so when you create checks and balances on that power, then you begin to demonstrate what I call, or what Jennifer Fried actually calls, institutional courage.
I love that. And I think those are really actionable, like firm takeaways at the individual level, at the team level, at the executive level, that you just change your behavior even a little bit in those regards. I think it's pretty valuable.
Yeah. Can I offer one more piece of advice?
Of course, please.
One of the things that I tried to do in this book that was really important to me is to extend some grace to people who are causing harm unintentionally, because we all have biases. Like, we all bully people from time to time. And so when I get feedback that I've said or done something biased, or that I bullied someone, I try to do what I call ACK. And that's 5 A's and a C with an exclamation point. So the first A is to be aware. It's really tempting when you get this feedback to become unaware, to deny it. Don't do that. I've done that many, many, many times. So I have great but I just being aware that you need to become aware that it's your responsibility to be aware is important. Then you want to accept the consequences. Sometimes there are consequences for having harmed someone, and fighting those is just going to push this behavior underground and make it worse. Then you want to actually make amends, and that so maybe even go beyond the accepting the consequences. You also want to acknowledge what you did wrong, and your acknowledgement means a lot. You need to understand, put the no in your acknowledgement, not I'm sorry you feel that way, right? And then now that you've done those 4 things, now you can apologize. So that's the 5th A. But there's a lot to do before you get to apologize, and then you need to change. Don't keep making the same mistake over and over.
I love that. That's the ACK framework. Is that the right
That's the ACK acronym.
I love it. Well, Kim, I deeply appreciate the perspective. I feel like you're so thoughtful on these topics. And one of the things I particularly appreciate is it's not just the sentiment, it's the memorable way you phrase it in a way that actually sticks in the head, which is awesome. For people that are interested in learning more or want to go find Radical Respect, want to read or follow you, where would you send them?
So radicalrespectbook.com is the URL. You can also follow me on LinkedIn, and you can buy the book wherever you like to buy books. Go to your local bookstore, go to Amazon, go to Barnes & Noble, go to Best Bookstore, anywhere you like to buy books.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I really enjoyed the conversation. Everyone should go find Radical Candor if you've not read it already, and Radical Respect now. And I appreciate you imparting so much wisdom. Thank you so much. Really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, you can subscribe on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Please also consider giving us a rating or leaving a review, as that helps other listeners find the podcast. For more Flex Index content, including past episodes, our Flex Index newsletter, and monthly research reports, visit flex.scoopforwork.com. See you next time.